What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Cups Analytics channel. My name's Alex Cups, and today we have a very special guest, JJ Zachariason, creator of Late Round Fantasy Football, one of my favorite creators in the entire fantasy space. Absolutely stoked to chop it up with him today. JJ, how are you doing, man?
I'm good. This is fun, man. I've been, obviously we've been talking a little bit, but also followed your journey on, becoming this tout that you are, and so you think you can tout, and you crushed it. And as I've told you many times now, I'm glad the nerds got that W. You did it for all the nerds out there. So congratulations.
That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad we could bring one home for the nerds. But yeah, I figured what better topic for JJ and I to talk about than our favorite late round targets in these 2026 fantasy football drafts. JJ being the creator of Late Round Fantasy, it only felt right to identify some of our favorite players in those late rounds. So when it comes to determining a late round player, for me, I'm just going off of ADP over 140 or later. And that ADP is coming from Fantasy Life, which aggregates ADPs across all of the big platforms: Sleeper, Yahoo, ESPN, different fantasy rules. All of those different platforms come together, and we're using that Fantasy Life ADP for this video. So we're going to be going over 5 guys that we think are going late in these fantasy football drafts that could be breakouts in 2026. You can find the link to this ADP on Fantasy Life in the description. Use promo code CUPS10 as well to get 10% off a premium subscription over on Fantasy Life. And without further ado, let's get right into it. So JJ, start us off here with your first player going over pick 140. We have quarterback Malik Willis coming off the board on average at 142.8 over on Fantasy Life, QB 21. What is it about Malik Willis's profile that stands out to you in 2026?
Yeah, I look at it and I think the real question is, why would you not draft Malik Willis with like one of the last picks of your draft? In his 3 Green Bay starts, he averaged 58 rushing yards per game, a rushing touchdown per game. That's 11.8 points per game with his legs alone, which is crazy, not sustainable, but that's still a very, very high number. We've had 25 quarterback seasons since 2011 where a quarterback had 7 or more points per game via rushing. So that's a number that's very attainable for Malik Willis. I mean, that's almost a lock as long as he's starting, who threw the ball 300 or more times in that season. So they were starters for most of the season. They had good rushing floors, 7 or more points per game. Of those 25 seasons, 22 of those quarterbacks ranked as top 10 quarterbacks in fantasy football in points per game. Only 3 of them ranked outside the top 10, and all 3 of them ranked inside the top 20, which is technically higher than where Malik Willis is going right now. I kind of see Willis in this situation as similar as how we've treated like Justin Fields in the past, where when he started, like when Fields has been on the field and has gotten, starter reps, he's been very, very usable in fantasy. And then if he gives you a 2 or a 3 touchdown game through the air, that's when you're getting that like 25 plus point outing from the player. Obviously you look at Miami right now, and I don't think, look, I've been doing this for a while. I told you before, I'm Unk now. I've been doing this for a while. I have not seen a wide receiver room in all my years of analyzing this game this bad, as bad as Miami's. Pass catching room in general. I know they have Devon Achane, but there's just a lot of unproven young players that, some journeymen too, that have just bounced around. But I'm not very high on that, but I think that we just have to ask ourselves the question of, what if Malik Willis is just a better passer than we know? We don't have that answer. The sample size is so small of what Malik Willis is as a thrower. And obviously he played in a pretty advantageous situation in Green Bay under LaFleur, an offense that's consistently been top half of the league in touchdowns per game. But at the very least, I think you're going to get a rushing floor with him. And then if he's just a better passer than we expect, very easy to see a top 12 season from Malik Willis this year if things kind of break right.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you on Malik Willis being one of like the higher upside swings at the fantasy position, especially coming off the board at QB 21. Definitely feels like a big swing there. The one thing that really, puts me off a little bit is just like you touched upon, Miami's offense in general is just projecting to be one of the worst in the league. They're 4th lowest right now in implied team totals at just over 19 points per game for 2026. So you're pretty much banking on, if I understand you correctly, you're banking on the rushing production and you're hoping he can take a step as a passer. Are you worried at all about the overall offensive production in terms of putting points on the board, where a lot of those fantasy points come from for the quarterback?
Tremendously. Yeah. I mean, it's huge. Like if he had, here's another way of thinking about it. Like I think if he had an alpha on the team at wide receiver, Willis would probably be like QB 15, QB 14. Like he'd be going a lot higher than he's actually going. So I think a lot of this is embedded in his ADP in general, him going after QB 20 in most drafts. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem, but I also think that's why his cost is where it's at. And we're both looking at numbers all the time, and we are the first to admit that we get stuff wrong all the time. The market gets stuff wrong all the time. And so even if that Miami team is just a little bit better, if Malik Willis is just a little bit better of a passer than what we're projecting right now, it's very easy to see him outpacing this ADP. I would argue that where he's being drafted, given the rushing floor, it's almost impossible for him to not beat this ADP. Now, you don't want him to just beat it and be QB 18. That doesn't really help you in with your fantasy teams, of course. But this kind of rushing production, like I genuinely believe that Malik Willis has an opportunity to be, like have the type of impact that Lamar Jackson has had on the ground, because we've seen that in the games where he has started, and there were some games in Tennessee where they had handcuffs on him, but I just don't think you can do that if you're hoping that he's your long-term starter in Miami. They're going to allow him to do what they think he can do best, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But they got to find out if it works out or not.
Yeah, for sure. So being the late round quarterback guy, that's kind of your thing. Do you feel comfortable in your 2026 redraft leagues grabbing Malik Willis at QB 21 and just calling it a day? That's your guy. You're planting the flag. You're going into the season with him as your QB1, or are you more comfortable maybe grabbing one of those guys going a little bit ahead of him? Maybe a guy like Sam Darnold, Matt Stafford, one of those guys, and then grabbing Malik as the upside play as your QB2? Or how would you approach it, from just a pure redraft approach in 2026?
So I think it depends on what the league looks like. I always tell people, like, look at what your free agency pool is likely going to look like, after the draft is over. And if there's if there's like 6 or 7 or 8 starters out there, then you can feel a little bit more confident, because if Malik Willis doesn't work out, then you can stream the position. And I've got proof and data by tracking this over the last 10 years that you can stream low end QB1s very easily in fantasy football. We do it on my other podcast, Living the Stream, all the time. We do it every year. And so you can definitely do that. The thing that I would say is on the favorable side, the Dolphins have a very, very good opening schedule for passing and for those good environments or better environments. So I think there's a chance that he would actually be okay to start the season. With that being said, I'm fine with pairing him with either another, maybe not as upsidey as he is, because he has obviously a scary floor, but maybe a higher floor player like a Tyler Shuck, I think is fine if you want to do that. Or if you want to play it even safer and get like whatever falling value happens in that like giant tier up to like QB 15 or so. If it's Brock Purdy, I love Purdy and his value. Bo Nix is another one that should have a stable floor and is probably underdrafted right now. So I'm fine with pairing him, but it just depends on like the environment that you're in and how deep your league is and so on. There's gonna be plenty of leagues where Malik Willis doesn't even get drafted. So he might even be sitting on your waiver wire, and you just got to be aware that this is a profile that has an interesting ceiling, and it could come to fruition, and you got to be, the first one to jump on that if you just see a little bit of a glimpse of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in complete agreement with you on Malik Willis. I do agree. He's probably the highest upside guy coming off the board in that range of the draft. He's going around the aforementioned Tyler Shuck, Sam Darnold's. I definitely see him offering us a stronger ceiling than those two in particular. But with that being said, let's jump over to our second player here. One that stuck out to me coming off the board at 142.7 on average, tight end 16. It's Oronde Gadsden. Oronde Gadsden, I get it. The news coming out of Chargers camp recently has been less than ideal for Gadsden. He's listed on first unofficial depth chart as a co-starter with both Charlie Collar and David Njoku. Not great to see for Gadsden, but he's had such a drastic fall in ADP over the past 4 or 5 months. He was going above pick 100 back in April and May, and now we're seeing him come off the board around 143. So I think the risk with Gadsden, we're getting to a point where it's definitely baked in my opinion, for a guy that has as high of an upside swing at the tight end position of almost any tight end on the board, in my opinion. Gadsden had one of the better rookie seasons we've seen, or at least, stretches of games in his rookie season than we've seen from any other tight end in history. He had 8.9 fantasy points per game over his rookie season, 21% receiving yard market share. So he accounted for 21% of the total receiving yards on the Los Angeles Chargers in games he played, 1.66 yards per out run, and an 8.7 ADOT, which was towards the top of all tight ends in 2026. His year 2 comps, which I do for every player coming into their second season, I generate the 20 closest comps based on their prospect profile along with their rookie production. His year 2 comps are solid. He has 70% of them hitting at least one tight end 1 finish in fantasy points per game across their careers, 35% top 5, and a quarter, 25% top 3. So the upside's there, in my opinion, with Oronde Gadsden. He draws some interesting comps like Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Travis Kelce, TJ Hawkinson. These guys that were drafted way higher than he was in their rookie seasons, he's kind of making that jump based on what he did in the production aspect of things in his rookie year. So I think the argument for him is just that all of the stuff we've seen come out of camp, it's baked in his current price going after pick 140. We've also seen non-blocking and like non-traditional tight ends under Mike McDaniel be super successful in fantasy. Darren Waller last year, we saw him put up huge numbers. We've seen Jonnu, if you remember from a couple of years ago with Mike McDaniel, also super effective. And then going back a little bit further, rookie Greg Dulcich, remember a guy that was an awesome play under Mike McDaniel as well. Another guy that's not known for his blocking. And actually, it's funny, Dulcich does come out as Gadsden's number 1 comp going into year 2. So interesting there. But I think he's going around guys like Hunter Henry and Chiga Okonkwo, especially with Diggs signing in Washington. I mean, I'm just seeing Gadsden as a much higher upside swing if he can capture that work at the tight end position in the receiving game for the Chargers. What do you think about Gadsden in year 2?
Yeah, it's funny. So a couple things. I think that he's one of those players similar to like a Malik Willis, where if you're going to go after him, I'd probably, and I don't, go double tight end in a ton of leagues or, a ton of managed leagues or, double quarterback. But I do think that he's one of those guys that you could pair him with a maybe safer option or pair him with another high upside option and hope that one of them, you're increasing your probability of at least hitting on one of them. Right. So I do think that he's interesting from that perspective, but we also, so at late round, we have a new metric that we created this offseason called market score, which is essentially, it looks at ADP. And so every ADP, I'm on your channel right now, so I can talk really nerdy about this, but every ADP, every spot in average draft position has some sort of expected points per game just based on history, right? So it's just regression analysis. So you're just saying, okay, this guy's, this wide receiver drafted 60th overall. This is what we can expect from a PPR point per game perspective from a wide receiver that's drafted at that point in time, right? And so what market score does is that it looks at that ADP and it starts to factor in a general score for a player. And then you can look and it'll factor in previous season inputs as well. Okay. Like predictive ones, obviously, stuff like yards per out run at wide receiver, I think is one of them, but it's also like there's interesting ones like yards after the catch ability at wide receiver gets a little bit of love. And then there's also, factors in there that look at where their teammate ADP is, right? So like teammate score type stuff and offensive environment score and stuff like that. And so it looks at all these factors and it spits out a score for a player, a market score. It's a scale from 0 to 100. It's similar to the ZAP model. So it's very similar to the ZAP model in that, with the ZAP model, the prospect model, I'm taking draft capital and kind of pivoting off of that, right, as like a baseline for these players' scores. This is the same thing, except it's ADP, and then I'm pivoting off of that, and it's more predictive than what ADP is, right? And the fun thing that you can do with market score is find historical comps. And so I look at players in history who have a similar overall ADP, positional ADP, career year, and market score, and I can find comps that way, and I can see how those players performed. And Oronde Gadsden, his market score comps are freaking unbelievable. I mean, they're so good, and it's scary because of all the stuff that's been going on, like you said, in the in the media and the way that they're talking about the tight end position. And I've been plenty scared off by that because I do think it's very real in the way that they want to run that offense. But like His number one comp is year 2 George Kittle, where George Kittle scored 15.3 PPR points per game. You get Noah Fant year 2, who scored over 10 points per game. So 5 of his 10 top comps all scored double-digit PPR points per game, which is strong at the tight end position, right? His average was within those 10 was 11 PPR points per game. So, it's a solid out. That would be a solid outcome for a guy going as late as he is. So there's a lot of like that historical stuff that really favors Gadsden, which is what's pulling me back in. I think that in most cases, a player who is kind of one-dimensional, more so just this route runner, not necessarily like a phenomenal blocker. That's a player in this kind of environment, in this kind of offense, where you need that tight end to generally, the way that he will likely want to run this thing. You want some blocking ability there. It might not matter as much for Gadsden because he's just a really good pass catcher. I'm willing to take that on, especially in a season-long league. I think it's a little bit different in best ball, where you invest in that and it could go south. Like, it could really, really go south. But in a season-long league, you can make up for it really easily. You just go to the waiver wire, or you take another tight end that you think that has that kind of upside as well. So I like the Gadsden call out. I've been more middle of the road with them, but without a doubt, analytically, and we're numbers bros. This is the guy that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, he really, to me, feels like one of the bigger discrepancies between what we've heard this offseason and I guess what the numbers are telling me, and also what I expected going into the offseason. I expected Gadsden to be a top 10 tight end option. If you asked me in like February, March, like, where do you think Gadsden's going to go? I would have probably said like around, after Harold Fannin, around that range, based on what we saw as a rookie. So it is a little crazy to think when you like frame it that way in terms of what we thought a couple months ago based on what we think now. With obviously, we're hearing stuff coming out of camp, and we have to put some weight into that. We can't just completely ignore it, but I'm an analytical guy. You are too. I like to trust the numbers a lot and try not to let the coach speak and the initial depth chart really sway me off of those. Maybe if they brought somebody in that was a little more proven. Obviously, Njoku, we saw what Fannin was able to do, regardless of Njoku being on the Browns last season. He wasn't much of a stopper when it came to keeping Fannin from scoring fantasy points. And Charlie Collar, obviously, he had some interesting stuff about his prospect profile. He's actually more of a receiving threat than he's done in the NFL based on what he did in college. He's been a guy I've actually liked for a really long time, but at the same time, I don't think he would come in and stop Oronde Gadsden from producing in the receiving game. It's all going to come down to what percent of the routes Gadsden's running. Is he going to be on the field enough to be a reliable fantasy asset? That remains to be seen. But like you said, I'm in complete agreement with you when it comes to the numbers with Gadsden and what it says about his year 2. So definitely one of my favorite targets there. So let's jump back over to you, JJ, for this third player coming off the board at 184.2. So we're getting a little later here. We have Titans rookie running back Nick Singleton. So go ahead and give me your spiel on Singleton going into 2026.
I think you're going to have to be patient if you draft him, for sure, right? It's one of those players that you might even not have to draft and then just wait and see how the season kind of starts playing out. And then when you see just like some glimpse of him maybe playing a little bit more snaps or doing a little bit more in the offense, you jump on it because I do like the profile. But the reason why I'm calling him out today, I'm nervous about Tony Pollard this year at his ADP. I feel like it's a little bit of a contrarian take because there's a lot of big sites and names out there that are pretty into Tony Pollard. But he's had 3 straight years of a sub 0.8 yards per route run rate. I found that to be pretty predictive of future target share and receiving success. He's 29 years old. And last year when Tajay Spears was in, we saw big usage shifts with Tony Pollard. They used Tajay Spears a lot as a pass catching threat. Now, obviously, brand new coaching staff. We have no idea how they're going to split this backfield. But if you look at history, Spears has been used mostly as a receiving threat. Tony Pollard, like I said, he's 29 years old. He hasn't been the most efficient receiving back. Maybe something goes on in terms of just him slowing down and just not being as effective as a runner. And so I look at Nick Singleton, a coaching staff that did decide to draft him, right? And it's also a coaching staff that has Brian Daboll as offensive coordinator. And over the last 2 years, we've seen Daboll use day 3 running backs as primary options in the backfield, and Tyrone Tracy and Cam Scadaboo. The Zap model liked Nick Singleton. He had an 81st percentile best season reception share, which is one of the inputs in the model. He had an 87th percentile adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt. That's adjusted for both age and program strength. So really good receiving profile. And oh, by the way, he's big and he's athletic. He didn't test at the combine because he hurt his foot at the Senior Bowl, but he's a really athletic player. And that tagged him with a what I call a low risk profile. So I just look at, it's called Draft Capital Delta, and it looks at where the guy was drafted in the NFL draft. It looks at his ZAP score, and it finds sort of the difference between the two in terms of, expectation. And if a guy's like way better in terms of ZAP score, he's a low risk profile. And then the opposite would be a high risk profile, right? Where the NFL essentially overdrafted that player. So the model's viewing Nick Singleton as a low risk player, which is really good. It's a day 3 player though, of course, day 3 running back. They don't pan out at a very high rate. And if you look at some of his comps, it does scare me a little bit because we could be going down the path of like CJ Procise, these athletic guys who had pretty good, even like a DJ Giddens that we saw last year, who had a really good, athletic profile, and really good production profile, but there's just something missing to their game. So I certainly understand that this could go south for sure, but it's an ambiguous backfield for all intents and purposes. And, I could see, Tennessee not being very good, and by the end of the season, them wanting to sort of switch things up and see what they have in Singleton.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. I think he might come out looking a little better in your stuff than mine. Just because one thing that I'm measuring athleticism through relative athletic score. Obviously, he didn't generate one since he didn't perform at the NFL Combine.
Yep.
That, when someone doesn't generate a RAS for me to use to measure athleticism, what I do is I just base it off of similar players at that position that got drafted around where they did. So it doesn't look great for Singleton because a lot of the running backs that you're seeing come off the board in the 160s, 170s, they're not super athletic, or they're not generating good relative athletic scores. So I think that maybe unfairly docks him a little bit after hearing what you're saying about, obviously we know he is an athletic player based on his college production and stuff we've seen on field speed, stuff like that for Singleton. So probably something I'll want to take into account with his profile there. A couple guys, like you said, his comps are a little scary. They're also scary for me. Only 1 out of 20 ever had an RB2 or better finish in their career for Singleton. Some interesting guys here, like Ollie Gordon is one that had some really solid early production in college, but just hasn't yet had a chance to, I guess, prove it in the NFL. Hasn't really found his way to the top of the depth chart yet. You mentioned that one of the best things about Singleton's profile, in my opinion as well, is his receiving ability. But you also mentioned, Tajay Spears, we've seen him be one of the better receiving backs in the NFL in recent years. He was top 10 last year in receptions per game and targets per out run among the running backs. So I'm curious, you're kind of using the Singleton bet as a hedge against Pollard, but are you worried at all that we should really be more worried about Tajay Spears being the one that stops Singleton from really producing in fantasy?
So what I found through the ZAP model and through working, with prospects, is that at running back, the receiving stuff is more of a talent proxy as opposed to that's the role they're going to play in the NFL, right? So if I find a running back that has a really bad receiving profile, I'm going to assume that number one, first and foremost, he might not be talented enough to see work on every down, and that his college team isn't feeding him in every single way possible. And then secondary to that, he's probably not going to do that much in the NFL. It's very hard to find a productive NFL running back as a receiver that was unproductive in college. It just does not happen very often, right? Like that's the thing with like Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt right now with all of the buzz that's surrounding him. I mean, I get it. I moved him up my rankings because they're clearly going to want to force it a little bit with him and they want to use him in that way. But dude has never been a receiver and it's frightening, right? Like it's a very scary thing to bet on. And but the thing is with Singleton, it's like it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be like a 12% target share type player in the NFL. It's more so, Penn State was using him in these sort of situations, in these scenarios, while they did have a early down grinder in Katron Allen also, who was very much the opposite of Singleton in terms of not the pass catcher, very much the in between the tackles kind of guy and not like the finesse player that Singleton is. And so I do think, though, that to your point about like Tajay Spears being the pass catcher, and me bringing up Tony Pollard and being afraid of what Tony Pollard's profile looks like, it gives Singleton multiple outs, right? Like there's an out here where if Tony Pollard doesn't look good, if they want to change things up, or if he gets hurt, I don't think Tajay Spears just takes over necessarily. I think Singleton has more of the body and the ability to carry a big workload. But then if Tajay Spears goes down, they might slip Nick Singleton into that role too. You know, there's multiple outs here. It's like very similar to how I view like a Jonah Coleman, where Jonah Coleman's a do-it-all back. And I think that the Broncos went after Coleman in the draft because he can back up both RJ Harvey and J.K. Dobbins. He's just not great and not as good at the things that they do, those specific things they do, but he can do all of those things. And so I see it similarly with Nick Singleton, the difference being I think RJ Harvey and J.K. Dobbins as a duo is probably a little bit better than Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. And this is also a team that's not going to be more than likely that competitive. And as you get through the season, again, you might they might be thinking, hey, we want to see what we have in Singleton as we approach, the 2026 offseason and 2027 offseason and see, what we want to do in the draft, what we want to do in free agency, because both these guys are also free agents, I believe, next year, and Pollard and Spears.
That's an interesting point, actually, that I haven't heard brought up yet, is the chance we see Singleton late in the season when it really matters. If they want to see what they have before they get to next year's draft, I don't think that many people are expecting the Titans to be super competitive in 2026. Maybe they come out and surprise us, but they definitely strike me as a team that could be interested in evaluating their talent as a whole before going into the next offseason. So that's definitely interesting. I'm going to keep an eye on Singleton, especially, I think he's probably going to go undrafted in quite a few redraft leagues, I would think. Yeah. So definitely a name to keep in mind. I think I agree with you on the fact that he does have the dual threat skill set that we've seen him, portray in college and be super effective. But I mean, I always go back to how much better would this guy have looked in my stuff if he came out after 2024, he would have been unbelievable.
I also wonder though, too, where he would have been drafted if he didn't hurt his foot at the Senior Bowl.
True.
Teams are that reactionary where they're just like, oh, I don't need to spend up to get this player because, I think that he might've been a day 2 pick if he had not hurt himself, gotten that foot injury. So yeah, you're right. Like if he would have come out early, like he was looked at as a very, very strong recruit and prospect, throughout that journey. And so yeah, I think there's just a lot to like about the upside case of his profile. Of course, it's a day 3 running back. Chances are it's not going to really pan out. But the other thing I should throw out there too, I've done a lot of research on which, because we will see a day 3 running back give you some production in fantasy every single year. Last year we had Woody Marks and stuff. And so and Kyle Monungai and Ja'Cory Cross-Kamara, but every year we see 1 to 1.5 or so day 3 running backs work out. And I'll be honest, a lot of it is not even, at least with the stuff that I look at, prospect evaluation based. It's more so just situation based. And I went back and I looked at all of the best. There's 15 guys or so that I looked at to try to find if there was any trend as to why these guys were breaking out. Turns out it really is just as simple as looking at their backfield's ADP. And if the ADP is lower, then there's a much, much better chance of that player giving you fantasy production in year 1, which is exactly why we always see day 3 running backs, usually not always, but 95% of the time, see them fall back into year 2. Why they're always obvious sells after year 1, because they were clearly getting all of that work due to there just not being that much competition in their backfields. And then once they do what they do, the team's like, oh, you're still not good enough. You're still a day 3 back. We're going to add some competition. And then they're just not as relevant in fantasy football anymore. And so this is one of those backfields again, where, Pollard's RB 29, like a mid-range RB 3 type player. That's usually around the range that you see some of these day 3 running backs as rookies give you something, because it's a depth chart that is climbable.
That's really interesting. And not to go off on a tangent, but that makes me more curious in a couple guys like Damon Claiborne could be interesting as well. If a guy like that, or Katron Allen, even in the Commanders backfield. I mean, those could also be some guys that they got some late round partners in that backfield. Nobody, I think, going ahead of pick 100. So could be interesting to see as well for those rookies.
Yeah. And you look at even like last year, like Woody Marks didn't have that because the Joe Mixon stuff happened. So like his ADP fell and tanked and really wasn't a thing.
Right.
Kyle Monangai, people were a little bit iffy with DeAndre Swift. He had a decent enough ADP. And then the Commanders backfield was totally up in the air. They got rid of Brian Robinson. No one really had like a favorite there. And then JCM sort of started to rise and such. But like you usually, Bucky Irving, his rookie season, Rashad White, was like a lower end RB2 type into RB3 range. Like it just goes back to the idea that it's very rare to, you can even go back to like James Robinson, for instance, but it's very rare for running backs in general to break out across the season where they're behind a legit stud, because it just means that they're handcuffed, right? That's just essentially what it means in the end. But there's a reason why there's that gap in ADP. There's a reason why that guy's being drafted so high. It's because he's going to see a big workload. Like he's just a good running back that's being drafted high. You just want ambiguous backfields. You want a backfield that is climbable and achievable. And like you said, Damon Claiborne, Katron Allen, Nick Singleton. I would even argue Jonah Coleman is another one where it's a very climbable depth chart. That's not like these guys are undeniable talents at this point. So all of those are very ambiguous, where it wouldn't shock me at all if we get like some production from those backs this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've got me a little more sold on Nick Singleton, given the opportunity that we think he should have. And the multiple outs thing, I think, is really interesting as well. So yeah, great stuff on Singleton. All right, next we're going to move over to the wide receiver position, going back up the board a little bit. Average ADP of 173.1. We have everyone's favorite rookie wide receiver, Dejon Stribling, over in San Francisco. And I mean, JJ, you and I think we're both cut from the same cloth when it comes to analytics, obviously. And for the most part, to boil it all down to this is a draft capital bet, if we're being real. Yeah. I mean, Dejon Stribling, he's not blowing anybody away with his production profile. He's an older prospect. He never had like a true massive breakout year. But he goes 33rd overall to the 49ers. And you could argue whether or not that was a reach. Obviously, I'm guessing since you do draft capital delta stuff, I'm guessing he comes out as a bit of a reach on your end, which I'll let you get into. But, I think the biggest thing for Stribling for me is he's almost guaranteed a role, in my opinion, at least the chance to prove that he deserves a role in this wide receiver room. I think we see from historical data that if you're drafted 33rd overall, even if you're, not a great prospect, you're going to get the chance to prove that you should be on the field. Like I said earlier, I do 20 closest comps based on these guys' production profiles and prospect profiles. Dejon Stribling comes out with quite an interesting range of names. His top two comps are Xavier Legette and Jonathan Mingo, two guys that, I think people felt were overdrafted as well at the time in their respective drafts, neither of which really panned out, obviously, in fantasy. But at the same time, I'd say Xavier Legette is one of the more downside comps for Dejon Stribling in terms of this list that I have. And he still put up almost 8 PPR points per game as a rookie, basically just by the simple fact of being on the field, I think Stribling's going to have the chance, especially with how things have unfolded in the 49ers wide receiver room so far this offseason. You see Ricky Pearsall go down with a season-ending injury. They bring back Deebo Samuel, who, looked far from his prime last year in Washington. And we obviously know with Big Mike that, he can struggle a bit with injuries. So I am really just banking on the fact that we're going to see Stribling on the field. And I mean, this could be completely vibes based. As a data guy, it feels a little weird to say this, but is there something there with maybe Kyle Shanahan wanting to just prove the haters wrong and say, you know what, damn it, I do know how to draft wide receivers. Maybe start scheming up some easy button stuff for Dejon Stribling, just getting him involved. He's a crazy athlete. He comes out with a size score of 96.7 in my model. So maybe just getting this guy in space with some easy button touches, seeing what he can do after the catch. I think there's a chance that we see Stribling have one of the higher upsides, I guess, in terms of late round wide receivers, just basically based on what that draft capital 33rd overall is guaranteeing him to see early in his rookie season. What do you think about Stribling?
Yeah, I don't know about you, but this year's draft class, I didn't mind. I really loved Jordan Tyson. Carnell Tate looked really good for me. Casey
Yep.
Concepcion, Mekhi Lemon, like those four looked really strong. And then after that, it was sort of like a choose your own adventure type of scenario, right? Especially as you like got deeper into day two, there were just a lot of wide receiver profiles where I'm just like, this is the most mid thing I've ever seen in my life. Like literally no day two wide receiver really stood out to me as like, this is the guy. And then in hindsight, I'm upset that I didn't, I was kind of in line with market from like a rookie rankings perspective with Stribling. And in hindsight, I wish I would have just leaned into draft capital a little bit more with him in those rankings. But with that being said, if we knew Ricky Pearsall was out for the year, we would have ranked him as a first round rookie pick. That's just the way that it would have been. But I don't know. With Stribling, there's obviously a lot of scary stuff to his analytical profile. I talked about how I look at draft capital delta and like low and neutral and high risk profiles. Usually high risk profiles are only there for like the bottom 10 to 15 percentile type players versus, ADP. Not to say that Stribling was a bottom 10 percentile player in the database, just that versus ADP, he didn't look very good. And there's been 20 of them in the top 100 since 2011, top 100 draft capital. Only one of those players has scored 12 or more PPR points per game in their rookie season, and that was Tank Dell. So wow. I am a little bit concerned about that precedent. You look at his breakout score, which is a metric that I developed that looks at receiving yards per team pass attempt, and it adjusts it for program strength and age. And it gives you just like a score 0 to 100 for a player to basically say, okay, did you break out early? How strong was that receiving yards per team pass attempt number? And instead of looking at it, like I know people use breakout age, you might use breakout age too, but breakout age is very binary in nature, right? It's either you broke out or you didn't. This is more of that like gradient, if you will, to be able to say like, okay, you were close to that break. It's not as like black and white.
Yeah.
But breakout score as a metric is just as predictive as draft capital for top 100 wide receivers when you're trying to predict first 3-year output in their best 2 seasons out of their first 3 in PPR points per game. So breakout score is like the metric for me that I look at for top 100 wide receivers, especially once you get into day 3, it's chaos. This, like, it's just wild, like crazy things happen with day 3 wide receivers. But Dazon Stribling had a 31st percentile breakout score. And that's also one that generally just does not bring that much goodness from a true, breakout perspective in the NFL. With that being said, I do think that this is a situation where, like you said, opportunity is clearly there. The size is clearly there. And one of the things that I wish I leaned into more when I was evaluating him was that, number one, he's a good blocker. We know that, like, just based on what people have been saying and stuff. Like, it's not like I'm grinding film to see how well they are as blockers. But the other thing, though, is that he has kind of a decent yak profile for his size. And that is something that has worked very well historically in the Kyle Shanahan scheme. We've seen that with Brandon Ayuk. Obviously, Debo was a great yak guy. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we do see a lot of those like easy crossers to Stribling and allowing him to use that after the catch ability and his crazy athleticism. And this is the one offense and one coach where you probably are going to be able to maximize that. So I'm a Stribling bro in season long, like period. Like I'm in. I've been drafting him. I think he's a great dart in a managed league. I do think that there's a lot of question marks from a dynasty perspective, but in season long, where the cost is just a late round pick and it's not that big of a deal if they don't pan out, I'm going to take Stribling all the time.
Yeah, could not agree more. It's funny that you mention how much of a fit he just feels like a Shanahan wide receiver, because we do see in my 20 closest comps, Ayuk, Debo Samuel, Dante Pettis all come up. Yeah. So, he very clearly fits the bill for a guy that Kyle Shanahan would like for one reason or another. So makes sense that we saw him get drafted by San Francisco. I would say, I do agree that there are some question marks on the dynasty front, obviously, but I haven't checked ADP on the dynasty rookie class in a while. I'd made a video maybe a month ago, and this was pre-Pearsall knee injury. So I'm guessing he's moved up, but he was going off the board at 212 on average. a month ago, which is just, it's ridiculous. Like we have people like Malachi Fields and Jeremy Bernard. And I mean, I think those are the type of guys that you're saying, like, it's just an absolute wasteland. Like these guys just have the most meh prospect profiles from the numbers, in my opinion. So yeah, when you get to that point, it's just like the bet on the draft capital, just, even like you said, as someone who clearly was overdrafted, it still feels like a better bet than, other production profiles that I don't really feel like they separated from him enough to be worth the extra price.
Yeah. I mean, for me, and like the Zap model liked like Jeremy Bernard a little bit more, but they were all in the same tier. It was like Bernard, even Denzel Boston. It was like this. I know Boston's crushing it right now, but like, or seemingly, but like there were red flags to Boston's profile. I thought, like all of those guys, Omar Cooper, even it didn't like Omar Cooper as much as the consensus did. And like, I just, looking back, when I do like the prospect guy and I do my rookie rankings and stuff, I'm in like this frenzy of trying to get this thing out and like, really trying to think about this stuff and like balancing time and trying to be thoughtful with the analysis and stuff. But it is the one, like the scheme fit for Stribling is one that I wish I spent a little bit more time on and with, because yes, it's sort of like hindsight because we're seeing it come to fruition today and now, or we think it could come to fruition. But I do actually think the scheme fit makes a lot of sense for him in particular.
Yeah, 100%. And one last thing before we move on from Stribling, I just wanted to note for anyone out there drafting your redraft leagues on Sleeper in the next week or two, I've been doing some ADP analysis. This is a little bit of a teaser for a future video, but if you're drafted on Sleeper, DeJon Stribling is currently coming off the board, pick 202.4 as the wide receiver 76. I don't know what Sleeper has against DeJon Stribling, but he was buried in like startup ranks in like the 2000s, even up until like a month ago as well. So something Sleeper just doesn't like DeJon Stribling. If you have a redraft league over there, just grab DeJon Stribling with your last pick. I mean, there's literally, he's completely free. And like JJ and I have said, we see a path to an opportunity to produce. So definitely an interesting wide receiver there. And we're going to finish off here with one more guy from JJ, going back to the tight end position. Average ADP of 183.4. We're going to talk about Terrance Ferguson. So JJ, go ahead and let me know what you think about Ferguson in 2026.
So I loved Ferguson as a prospect, really athletic, had the right kind of build, just had the right profile in general. We use breakout score at tight end as well. We rebuilt the tight end model this offseason, my colleague, Brandon Gadula and I, and breakout score is an input for that tight end model. He had a 75th percentile breakout score. That's age and program adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt. He had a height adjusted speed score, which is the number one athletic measurable that we throw into the tight end model. Those in the 80th percentile. He's 6'5", about 250. His best season in yards per route run was in the 65th percentile. His best season in first downs per route run in college was in the 71st percentile. I mean, it was a very, very solid profile overall. And then you look at what the Rams have right now and what they've been doing. Obviously, we saw them run a lot of heavy last year, tons of 13 personnel, still a lot of 12 personnel as well. With late round tight ends, you do want a path for them to be a potential top 2 target getter on their team. But I do think that with Ferguson, there's a little bit of additional context, and it's just different in general than what you typically see from some of these late round tight ends. Number one, they don't really have a wide receiver 3. Like anyone that's totally reliable, right? Like I think Ferguson is the sort of like this de facto slot option for them. If you look at the way that they deployed their tight ends last year, Ferguson doubled up basically every other tight end in slot rate last season. And slot rate, by the way, when you look at how tight ends perform against ADP expectation, N-1, year N-1 slot rate. So previous season slot rate does have some predictive value for how well they perform against ADP expectation the following year, which is a really good sign for someone like Isaiah Likely, for instance, this year, right? And so not only that, but another trend to the same point about looking at guys and how they perform against ADP expectation is average depth of target. Terrance Ferguson had a 17.9 ADOT last year, which is just beyond crazy, right? It's just a wild way of deploying a tight end. And then again, like you look at this team, and yes, you have Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams, but historically, Sean McVay offenses just don't target the running back position. They've been like bottom 3 in running back target share every single year since Todd Gurley left that team. And so it's really, to me, I'm looking at Ferguson. I think he could easily be the number 3 target getter and one of the best offenses in football. And then you just think of a world where, what if Nakua gets suspended? What if one of them get injured? Like all of a sudden that opens things up tremendously to him not only being a red zone threat, but also just like this de facto slot option and guy that can move around the formation. I do have to rant a second too, because we're seeing this shift in the way that these teams are constructing, or how these teams are constructing their offenses, and how, we saw the Jags, for instance, they get a tight end in round 2. They turn around, they get Tanner Kozio later in the draft, and everyone's talking about heavy personnel, 12 personnel. The thing that works for the Rams and why it worked for the Rams last year is because they're not just getting any generic tight end when they're drafting these guys. They're able to disguise so much with the types of tight ends that they have. And so a player like Terrance Ferguson, like Sean McVay will throw out his teams into heavy personnel, like 12 or 13 personnel. And then he'll move into 11 personnel, like at the formation, like before they snap the ball. And all of a sudden you're spreading these defenses out and they're all confused. And there's Terrance Ferguson playing the X role all of a sudden, but he's so athletic and good that he can do those things. And so teams are trying to like copycat what's been going on, but really what they need to be doing is thinking about why it's working and the versatility of these tight ends and the ability to do what the Rams and what these smart teams are doing. And this is why Sean McVay is a genius. He's always one step ahead of what, works against these defenses. And so I think Terrance Ferguson is that perfect chess piece for them to really dominate on offense. I think he's going to see a high target share as a result.
Yeah. Speaking of a chess piece, that might be the best way to describe the drumbeat we've been hearing about Terrance Ferguson coming out of training camp so far. I mean, we've got Sean McVay on record saying, like you mentioned, he knows every receiving role. He can line up in slot, out wide, in line. He can do literally anything. He's got yards after the catch ability. Like you said, the ADOT as a rookie was absolutely bonkers.
Crazy.
I mean, like, obviously a little bit of a small sample because he only had 25 total targets, but
right.
I mean, yeah, what did you said 17.9.
17.9. Yeah.
Second among all tight ends in 2025 was Darren Waller at 11.9. So 6 total yards higher than the second tight end. Truly insane stuff from Terrance Ferguson. Another thing I thought was interesting, you mentioned slot rate being predictive. Yeah. I also was interested looking at the wide rate as well. And Terrance Ferguson was the 3rd highest wide rate among all tight ends in 2025 as well, only behind Darren Waller and Colston Loveland. So 2 guys that were getting heavily utilized in their team's offensive passing offense. So I'm super interested in Terrance Ferguson in year 2. I know we mentioned potentially pairing Oronde Gadsden with another high upside tight end. If you want to take that approach, I think Terrance Ferguson is the perfect target for like a 2 tight end build like that. Absolutely massive upside. Going into his year 2 comps a little bit, one guy that pops is Trey McBride, a guy that was a little bit underutilized in his respective offense as a rookie, but still had a really solid and I think underrated prospect profile to a certain extent. I think in general, man, it feels like we've been just so spoiled by the tight ends producing like as rookies over the past couple of years. And I feel like the fantasy community is kind of forgetting our roots of, these tight ends take time for the most part. We've had Brock Bowers, we've had Loveland, Warren, Fannin. The 2025 class was insane, obviously. And I think Terrance Ferguson is getting lost in the sauce a little bit. He's kind of going under the rug, or at least was until the past month or so. I feel like he started to get some traction. But yeah, we just have to remember that it does take these tight ends some time on average to be productive at the NFL level. So totally a guy that I could see have a massive year 2 breakout in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I'll say this about Terrance Ferguson. I've done well over 350 best ball drafts this summer, and he is my highest rostered tight end. Terrance Ferguson.
Wow. What percent are we looking at?
I think I'm at probably like 21% or so with T-Ferg right now. Yeah. So I need it. I very much need it to happen this year.
I love it. Yeah. I'm all the way in with you, but that's our 5th guy. Those are the top 5 guys that we think could have solid breakouts in 2026 that are going in the late rounds of your fantasy drafts. Just to recap, Malik Willis coming off the board right around pick 140. Oronde Gadsden at 142.7. Nick Singleton, 184.2. Stribling, 173.1. And finally, Terrance Ferguson, all the way down at 183.4. So those are our 5 guys. JJ, thank you so much for hopping on, joining me on the Cups Analytics YouTube channel. Go ahead and let the people know what you got going on over the rest of the offseason and going into 2026.
Yeah, man. LateRound.com. The late round draft guide is out. If you guys are into game theory and strategy and such, do a lot of research before getting into the players to target, players to avoid, and all that kind of stuff that I know most people are more interested in. But the late round draft guide is available right now. And then the late round podcast, I do it. I think we're doing there's 4 or 5 shows in the feed right now. And then that's going to jump to even more in season per week. So, it's the thing that, it's the motor of late round fantasy football. So check that out, the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast.
Well, thank you so much, JJ, for hopping on. Make sure you go check out his channel, subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football, and also like and subscribe to the Cups Analytics YouTube channel. Stay tuned for some more content coming over the remainder of the offseason and going into the 2026 season. But that's all for this one. We'll see you in the next video.